Most crises don't start with sirens. They start with shortages, new rules, and sudden priority lists, where everyday resources get redirected to keep critical services running. In this video, we're breaking down the first 10 things that are most likely to be restricted, prioritized, or temporarily requisitioned during a serious emergency: fuel, food, water, medical supplies, power, communications, and more. And when I say hide, I mean the legal, common sense kind. Store responsibly, reduce unnecessary visibility, protect essentials from theft and damage, and build backups that don't collapse when one system fails. No paranoia, no illegal tricks, just practical prepping for beginners that keeps your household steady when things get unstable. Number 1, fuel. One quick boundary before we get practical. This is about legal, responsible preparedness, not about dodging lawful emergency orders or hiding supplies from authorities. In real crises, systems get messy fast, and the safest move is to be ready without putting yourself on the wrong side of the law. With that said, fuel is almost always the first resource that gets tightly controlled, because fuel is what keeps everything else moving. Ambulances, supply trucks, utility repair crews, water treatment plants, backup generators at hospitals, even basic trash collection. None of it works without dependable energy. When fuel becomes scarce, governments typically don't need to show up at private homes to seize it. They control it upstream by prioritizing deliveries, limiting purchases, and redirecting bulk supplies to essential services. The average person feels it as shorter station hours, cash-only pumps, quantity limits, rationing rules, and certain fleets getting priority access. The practical reality is that the fuel you can't buy is the fuel you can't use, even if you've got money in your pocket. For beginners, the smart approach is less about stockpiling and more about lowering your fuel dependency. Number 3, water. Water is one of the fastest resources to become controlled, not because it's rare in normal life, but because the infrastructure behind clean water is complex. Municipal systems need power, chemicals, functioning pumps, and trained staff. When any part of that system is strained, authorities prioritize keeping critical facilities running and preventing public health disasters. The public-facing version of this can look like boil water advisories, pressure drops, restricted usage, and distribution points where people line up for bottled water or bulk water. In drought conditions or post-disaster conditions, restrictions can expand quickly, and even when water is technically available, it may not be safe to drink without treatment. Beginner emergency preparedness with water is straightforward. Store a reasonable amount, have a way to make questionable water safer, and plan for sanitation. A lot of people only think drinking, but hygiene is where things get ugly. You need water for hand washing, basic cleaning, and keeping illness from spreading in your home. If you've ever lived through a local outage, you know the problem isn't just thirst. It's the total breakdown of normal routines. For storage, keep it simple and safe. Use food-safe containers meant for water, keep them clean, and store them in a cool place away from chemicals. If you're in an apartment, you may not have room for huge reserves, so focus on a smaller stored supply, plus a good filter, and the ability to refill when water becomes available again. If you own your home, learn where your main water shutoff is, because broken pipes and contamination can turn having running water into having a flooded house. This is one of those skills that isn't dramatic, but it saves you from a disaster within the disaster. For making water safer, the most reliable beginner approach is understanding the basics, boiling water when appropriate, and using proven filtration or purification methods according to the instructions of reputable products and public health guidance. You don't need to become a chemistry expert. You just need to avoid improvising in ways that create new risks. And plan sanitation like an adult. Trash bags, disinfecting supplies, hand hygiene, and a realistic strategy if plumbing doesn't work normally. Once water becomes complicated, health becomes complicated, because dehydration, poor hygiene, and stress all stack together. That's why medical supplies and everyday health items become the next category that gets prioritized and controlled. Number 4, medical supplies and medications. In almost every crisis, Storms, wildfires, major outages, pandemics, medical supplies shift from available to allocated. It happens fast because hospitals and clinics consume huge volumes of basic items: gloves, masks, disinfectants, oxygen-related supplies, IV fluids, and common medications. When supply chains tighten, governments and health systems prioritize professional care settings first because that's where lives are saved at scale. For regular people, the result is familiar. Pharmacies run out of certain meds, limits appear on over-the-counter products, and replacement items get expensive or hard to find. This isn't usually about someone coming to take your first aid kit. It's about you being unable to replace what you need, right when you need it. Beginner prepping here is mostly paperwork, routine, and common sense. If you rely on prescription medication, talk to your healthcare provider about continuity. Don't try to become your own doctor. The practical goal is to avoid gaps. Keep your prescriptions current, refill on time, and understand your options if your usual pharmacy is closed or out of stock. Keep a written list of medications, dosages, allergies, and key medical history for each household member. In a stressful situation, people forget details they normally know. A simple sheet of paper can prevent dangerous mistakes. Build a basic home medical kit that matches your real life, not a fantasy scenario. Wound care supplies, basic pain and fever relief, stomach-related meds, allergy support if needed, and hygiene items that help prevent infection. Add extras for family members with specific needs, like asthma supplies or items for glucose management, but only within what's legal and medically appropriate. Focus on prevention. Clean hands, clean surfaces, and the ability to handle minor issues at home so you don't add pressure to emergency services. Also, plan for the boring problems: blisters, minor burns, small cuts, and dehydration. In disasters, those small things become big because help is delayed and people are operating exhausted. Training matters too. A basic first aid class is one of the most beginner-friendly prepper essentials because it improves your judgment. You don't need dramatic gear if you don't know what to do with it. Medical planning connects directly to power planning because many medical needs depend on electricity. Refrigeration for certain meds, charging devices, keeping temperatures safe, and running basic communication. When the grid becomes unstable, everything gets harder, fast. Number 5, power and electricity. Power is a force multiplier. When electricity is stable, you can solve problems with convenience. Charge devices, cook quickly, keep food cold, pump water, heat and cool your space. When it's unstable, every task takes longer and costs more energy, human energy. In many crises, authorities prioritize restoring power to critical infrastructure first: hospitals, emergency dispatch, water treatment, and major communication hubs. That can mean rolling outages, planned shutoffs, or slower restoration for residential neighborhoods. The public sometimes interprets this as unfair, but it's usually a triage system. Keep the parts running that keep everyone alive. For a beginner prepper, the best power strategy starts with reducing how much power you need. That sounds obvious, but it's where most people win or lose. Have lighting that doesn't depend on the wall: flashlights, headlamps, and spare batteries, plus a safe way to recharge small electronics. Know which devices matter most in your house: phones, a radio, a small fan or heater if temperatures are extreme, and any medically important devices. Plan around those priorities instead of trying to power your whole life. Batteries and portable power often become scarce during emergencies because everyone buys them at once. The seizure here is simple. Stores run out, prices spike, and you're stuck. If you have even a small backup setup, keep it maintained and tested. Don't wait for the outage to discover a power bank won't hold a charge. Keep charging cables, spare adapters, and a way to charge in a car if that's part of your plan. If you use any fuel-powered generator, treat safety as the main rule, not a footnote. Carbon monoxide is a real threat. Generators must be used correctly, in safe ventilation, according to the manufacturer's directions. The goal is to get through a crisis, not create a second crisis inside your own home. And remember, in dense urban settings, generator use can be restricted by building rules, noise rules, or safety rules. Beginners should plan within their real environment, not a rural fantasy. Once power becomes limited, communication becomes unreliable too, not because phones vanish, but because networks overload and charging becomes a constant problem. That's why governments prioritize communication channels, and why you should treat communication as its own category. Number 6. Communication channels. During emergencies, communication systems get stressed in predictable ways. Cell towers lose power, networks overload, and misinformation spreads faster than facts. Governments and emergency services focus on keeping official alerts working and keeping channels available for first responders. The public-facing side of this can be emergency alerts, temporary restrictions in certain areas, priority access for emergency communications, and strong messaging to keep people calm and coordinated. In some cases, certain services degrade simply because too many people are using them at once. The result feels like communication is being controlled, even when it's just a system at its limits. Beginner emergency preparedness tips for communication are mostly about redundancy and clarity. Have at least 2 ways to receive critical updates if the internet is unreliable: a battery-powered radio and a way to keep your phone charged. Know your local alert system. Keep important phone numbers written down, not just stored in a device, because you may not be able to access accounts or contacts if a phone breaks or dies. Inside a family plan, decide in advance how you'll check in. Text messages often work when voice calls fail because they use less bandwidth. Pick a simple rule like send a short check-in at set times and a backup meeting place if phones are down. This is especially important for families with teenagers, co-parents, or people commuting across town. If you treat it like a real plan instead of a vague idea, it actually works. For two-way radios, the beginner-friendly advice is stay legal, get trained, and practice before you need it. If your area requires licensing for certain equipment, follow the rules. In a crisis, the last thing you need is to create legal problems or interfere with emergency services. A radio is useful when you know what you're doing with it. Without practice, it's just plastic and hope. Communication planning overlaps with movement planning because the moment roads close or curfews begin, the main question becomes, where are people? And how do we get everyone to the same safe place? That's why transportation and mobility are often the next area where restrictions show up. Number 9. Valuables and tradable commodities. When people hear government seizure, they often jump straight to gold, silver, and high-value assets. The honest, grounded way to talk about this is, in severe national crises, governments have sometimes restricted private ownership, private trade, or private convertibility of certain assets. A famous U.S. example is the 1933 gold restrictions tied to Executive Order 6102, which required certain gold holdings to be turned in under specific rules at the time. History doesn't guarantee the future, but it shows what's possible when a government is trying to stabilize a financial system under extreme stress. More commonly, in modern crises, the control shows up as reporting requirements, limits on large transactions, and restrictions around moving money across borders, especially when a country is trying to stop capital flight. For a beginner, the key preparedness point isn't buy this one thing. It's don't build your whole plan on a single asset class. In real emergencies, what matters most is practical utility: food, water, medical needs, power, and mobility. High-value items might hold value on paper while still being hard to use day to day. Also, in chaotic conditions, displaying valuable items can attract theft. So if you own valuables, the responsible approach is simple: store them securely, keep documentation, ensure what you can, and stay within the law. Don't assume you'll be able to easily trade valuables for necessities in the middle of a disruption. If you want a more practical angle for preparedness, think less about wealth and more about continuity. Consumables and essentials keep you stable. A stocked pantry reduces how much you need to buy when shelves are empty. Basic repair items keep your home functioning. Extra hygiene supplies reduce illness. In other words, the most useful currency in a crisis is the ability to avoid becoming desperate. This also ties into privacy and attention. The more a crisis escalates, the more every system relies on categories. Who needs aid? Who gets access? Who can work? Who can move? That brings us to the last, and often most overlooked thing that gets requisitioned in major emergencies: people's time and skills. Number 10. Your time and skills. In large emergencies, governments don't just manage stuff. They manage labor. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's indirect, but it's real. Essential workers may be required to report in. Medical professionals can be called into emergency service frameworks. Contractors may be assigned to critical repairs. In some places and situations, there are legal mechanisms that allow temporary mobilization of labor or mandatory participation in certain emergency actions, especially during wartime or declared states of emergency. Even without formal orders, social pressure can function like an order. If you have a skill the community needs, people will ask, and they may not take no well when stakes are high. Beginner prepping for this is mainly family planning. If you might be required to work, because of your job, your certifications, or your role, build a plan that keeps your household stable while you're away. Who picks up the kids? Who checks on elderly relatives? Where are important documents? What's the communication plan if phones are unreliable? What supplies does your family need to function independently for a few days? This is the kind of preparedness that doesn't look exciting on camera, but it's what separates calm households from panicked ones. Also, keep your personal readiness in shape: sleep, basic fitness, and stress management. In a crisis, your decision-making is part of your equipment. People make expensive mistakes when they're exhausted and hungry. If you want a beginner prepper rule that actually holds up, it's this: keep your life organized enough that you can respond without scrambling, and keep your expectations realistic. In emergencies, you may be asked to cooperate with evacuation, curfews, or emergency procedures. A lot of problems come from people reacting emotionally instead of practically. If you plan ahead, you can comply with the safety rules while still protecting your household's stability. That's what mature preparedness looks like. Not secrecy and drama, but calm systems that keep you fed, hydrated, informed, and able to adapt when conditions change.